Hey folks, welcome to Art History 141. In this class we'll be covering Paleolithic all the way up to pre-Renaissance. We'll be touching base on some other non-Western elements of art throughout different portions and regions of the world, but this is mostly going to be focusing on Western art in particular. And the book that I'm going to be using is Art Through the Ages, Volume 1, 16th edition. I'll be supplying you the PowerPoints on Canvas where you can go through the PowerPoints and be able to see exactly what figures I'll be discussing in lecture form. I would like to make it as personalized as possible in regards to it being an online class so that you have some element of audio and visual in these lectures that you can follow, as well as the coupled PowerPoints that go along with it. So with this video, we're going to start with chapter 1, and that PowerPoint is going to be a discussion on Paleolithic art as well as Neolithic art. And Paleo means old and Neo means new. So what we're going to be discussing here is a time period that spans to about 40,000 years. And within that 40,000 years, we're going to be starting, of course, with the Paleolithic, which means old. Obviously, the old would be the oldest, and the Neolithic. And there's a vast difference between the two. And the difference is that during the Paleolithic period, most of the folks at this time were hunters and gatherers, and they were surviving our last documented ice age. And during this ice age, they needed to be able to migrate, because during certain times of the year, seasonally, it would be much colder, and then other times would be much warmer. So what they would do is they would follow the bison. All right, they would follow the bovine, the bison, and the bison is going to be their migration guide, so to speak. So it's less about them following or creating their own paths or being trailblazers, and it's more about following the bison, because the bison would be the first to take off and to travel north whenever it would start warming up just a little bit during different times of the year. And of course, where the bison go, there's going to be a placement of a vegetation, some form of vegetation, and that would be the gathering aspects of being a hunter and gatherer. And then alongside the vegetation, the flora, is the fauna, which is the reindeer. So they'll be hunting the reindeer. They won't be hunting the bison, because the bison would be like their leader and the reindeer would be their food. So they would hunt the reindeer and they would gather through the flora, nuts, berries, whatever it might be, that the reindeer would be grazing upon, as well as the bisons would be grazing upon. So just keep that in mind, because the bovine or the bull or the bison is going to become very important as we see the transition from this Neolithic or this Paleolithic into Neolithic, and then into what's considered ancient civilization. So that's the big element of Paleolithic. The big element to Neolithic is around 9,000 BCE, where the Ice Age starts to regress or recede. It starts to go back, and things are starting to thaw out. And as things are thawing out, the soils and the nutrients in the earth are going to be so rich that the vegetation in the places where those glacial drifts were is going to be so abundant and fertile that the folks in the Neolithic period are not going to find any need to migrate anymore. They will a little bit, but they won't need to go as far north as what they originally would, because the bison are not going to be moving as far north at that time. They're going to be remaining in the area as soon as they hit some sound vegetation, which means that the reindeer will be doing the same thing. So in the Neolithic period, it's very synonymous to starting to settle down. That means that they're starting to develop shelters and remaining in one area at one time. The Paleolithic period is going to be a time where they're going to be migrating, and their home structures and their shelters and their abodes are going to be very temporary. So you're going to see a lot of residing in caves, and because of that, a lot of the artwork is going to be made and produced in the caves. Versus the Neolithic, a lot of the artwork is going to start to become a little more stationary and not so much of a portable element. So in Paleolithic, you'll have development of artwork in the caves, like drawings, and then you also have small little portable sculptures that go along with them because they're migrating. So just associate portability as well as stationary artwork in the caves with the Paleolithic. And then whenever it comes to the Neolithic, take into consideration the stationary aspects that are going to be equated to the fact that they're going to start settling and they're not going to be migrating as much. Okay, so with this video, feel free to go back and really kind of readdress some of the context. This is what I'm doing, is giving you some of the context of what's happening during this time so that you have an idea of why the artwork was made the way that it is. And I'll reiterate all these different contextual points as I'm going through some of the figures. And as I'm doing these videos and these lectures, I want you to really listen to the figures that I'm asking you to look at, because that's what you'll be asked questions on as well as tested on. If I don't talk about a certain figure within the PowerPoint, meaning like a certain slide, then you won't be tested on that. All right, I'll just make sure that you have an opportunity to know exactly what it is that you need to be quizzed or questioned on. Okay, map 1.1 in the PowerPoint is going to show you where predominantly a lot of the Paleolithic findings are going to be. And the reason that it's in the European and Northern European areas is because that glacial that receding glacier during the Ice Age took longer to recede out of Europe because it's more further north than the areas where we're going to see, where we found a lot of discoveries in the Neolithic. And that is map 1.2. So map 1.2 is present-day Turkey down into the Middle East. And this is where we're going to find a lot of Neolithic sites. It's because this is an area that warmed up sooner than that of map 1.1, which is more of the European areas. So it took more time for the folks in the European areas to develop Neolithic techniques, and they kind of held on to their Paleolithic techniques a little bit longer, except for parts of England, the UK, and Ireland, because the glacier was moving away from England to its east. But it was still very much compounded down on the rest of the mainland of Europe. So we'll see some Neolithic findings more prevalent in the UK, but not so much on the mainland of Europe. But we will see more Neolithic findings in regards to map 1.2 in present-day Turkey, all the way down to Jordan and present-day Iraq and Iran. So if you look at figure 1.1, this is the left wall image of the Hall of the Bulls in the cave in south of France, and you can see the dating is 1600 to 1400, but the Paleolithic actually dates all the way back to around 25 to 30,000 BCE. The reason I start with this one is because it is the most preserved. So it gives us a really great idea of what these wall cave, these paintings on the walls really look like. And essentially what was happening is those folks at that time were finished with the hunt, they were finished with the gather for the day, and they had time to create. And so they took that time to create and document visually what was going on around them. At this time, there's no documented written history. I'm sure that there were languages involved, because a lot of these areas in Europe as well as the Middle East are derived probably from the language or the linguistics that were occurring with these hunting and gatherers during this time. But there's nothing documented or recorded to prove a written language. They did have language, but a written record of their language. So these paintings, we call them paintings, but they're really drawings. But the reason we call them paintings is because they're using pigment from the riverbeds. So what they're doing is they're finding different stones in the river and grinding them down and turning them into a paste and then going in and drawing. So any area where you see there's a shaded kind of a red or a shaded yellow, an ochre or an iron-rich shading. A lot of that is pebbles that were found in the bottom of the rivers coming out from the melted glaciers. The black, on the other hand, is actual soot on the end of a stick. And so when they were building their fires for cooking purposes, those sticks that they were using probably to stir the fires or to grab the coals once they've cooled down, then they would go into the caves and they would start drawing what they see. And this is what they saw. They saw gatherings of lots of animals because that's what they were following. They were following the herd. They were following the bison and the bulls and those herds in particular. And where those were, there were the reindeer. And then, of course, the horses as well, and utilizing the horses as a huge element of swift hunt, if you will. If you can tame the horse and use it as a tool, an accessory to the hunt, then it can be much swifter. A really important term that you need to know right away with figure 1.1 is what's called profile perspective. That means that most of the images were just drawn in profile. There was not a lot of dimensionality. There was not a lot of frontal dimension. But they did attempt a frontal dimension. And so there's profile dimension, or profile composition, and then it moves into what's called, profile perspective, which is just the side. Then it moves into what's called composite perspective. And what composite perspective is, if you look at figure 1.1, is the bull. The bull is mostly in profile, but as soon as you get to the top or the crown of its head, the horns become frontal. And it's a twisted perspective. So it goes from almost all profile to suddenly that of frontal. So whenever you see that in regards to figure 1.1, we call that a composite perspective because we're compositing the profile and the frontal perspectives together into one. So they attempted depth, and through the composite perspective they were trying to get depth, but they still hadn't figured it out because it was mostly just about recording very quickly what was going on around them. Then we'll look at figure 1.2, and figure 1.2 is feline with human feet. And this type of drawing and painting would be called a shading. So they're shading, S-H-A-D-E, shading. And what they're doing is they're taking a full piece of charcoal and they're rubbing it into the stone. And instead of drawing a contour line with the charcoal, like we saw in figure 1.1 with the bull and the hollow bulls, they're just going on and shading the whole form, the whole positive form. And it gives you kind of a shadow-like image of what they're trying to depict. Now, this is a hybrid. And that hybrid element may be coming from their interest in imagination. It could be coming from the fact that maybe the felines and the tigers at that time, and these big cats, they may have more elongated legs at that time. And we do know that the felines at this time lived in those caves, some of the same caves that the humans resided in during this time. So there's definitely an appreciation for the feline. And then this is one of those indicators. There's also a discussion of the hybrid maybe being some kind of ritualistic worshiping element, which there may be some validity with, because when we move to figure 1.3, human with feline, lion head, you can see that it is a hybrid, that it is a tall standing, almost 12-inch tall, made out of ivory from a woolly mammoth, and it is carrying human features as well as feline features. So the upper body definitely has a feline element to it, and the lower body is very human. So it's possible that this is a worshiping deity or a worshiping idol that they're representing. We don't know for sure. I do want to tell you that right away with this class is during this period of time there's a lot of sparse evidence that is still changing to this day with new discoveries and new findings and new archaeological digs. So things are kind of always mutating, meaning they're mutable and they're always changing. So just keep that in mind, is that not everything is set in stone, no pun intended, during this time. Um, so here you have a very tall sculpture, one of the first found sculptures, and you can see it's dated 40,000 to 35,000 BCE. That's quite that's quite old. um, and it's led to believe that human with feline is a stationary sculpture. It wasn't meant to be carried, and that's because of the sheer size. It's a foot tall. Whenever you're needing to migrate and follow the herds of bison and bulls very quickly, you don't have time to carry a 12-inch tall sculpture. You need to keep your body as light as possible. So we believe that a lot of these sculptures that are found at this size were meant to remain in the caves where they were found during the archaeological digs and the archaeological findings. They were meant to stay there and be worshipped there. And whenever they come back the next year in that area, they re-worship these same idols or deities. Again, they could have been carried, but most likely they were not portable. They remained in one place and they were site specific because of their size. Versus figure 1.4, nude woman, Venus of Wildendorf, is much smaller. She's less than 5 inches, almost only 4 inches tall. And we believe that this sculpture in particular was something that was portable and that was carried with them. And because of the size, it's very lightweight as well. Limestone is not very heavy, versus the ivory from a woolly mammoth in figure 1.3 is a little heavier. So with it being lighter, they can just kind of put it into their pocket or whatever they had, whatever bag they were keeping on them, and stay in motion with this sculpture with them. And we also believe that the portability of it allowed for this constant element of abundance and fertility. So there's a belief that Venus of Wildendorf, or this nude woman, is actually a representation of fertility and abundance. And not just fertility and abundance for human offspring and fertility for more generations to come, but also for fertility towards the animals and the vegetation at this time. So this was a fertility worshiping goddess that they kept on them in hopes that whatever happened within their family units or within their communities and groups would be fertile, and mortality would be very low. And then also that of the flora and the fauna in which they were following, the bulls and the reindeer, and the vegetation that they were eating would be also plentiful, kind of copious in nature. So by having it on you, it kind of keeps this energetic feeling of we're always going to be having this fertility goddess with us to help guide us throughout these situations in hopes that our hunt will be successful, our warmth will be successful, so our children are safe and secure, and also the gathering of berries and floral substances will also be abundant. The reason I mention floral substances is like leaves, and that clothing. A lot of the clothing was a combination of warm leaves as well as the furs coming off of the reindeer. And you can see with the Venus of Wildendorf, she has a headdress on, and that headdress is supposed to depict that of different layered floral and also leaf-like, but I guess the botanical, right? Like botany, botanical like arrangements to keep the head warm, as well as being laced with fur on the inside. And we can see with figure 1.4 is another example of that kind of floral like headdress. And there's an argument on, well, maybe figure 1.4 is a representation of what womankind looked like at that time. And most of our evidence shows that it's not what average womankind looked like at that time. It's an emphasis on the goddess and having this abundance within her body to promote this symbolism of abundance and fertility. And what evidence is yielding to that idea is because of figure 1.4, a head of a woman, which we believe, or which art historians believe is more of a true representation of womankind at this time. It's not believed that this head of a woman is the head of a goddess. It's believed that it is an etching of an actual lady within that family unit, and that the artist is trying to really depict all the very specific features, very naturalistic and realistic features of that woman. Versus figure 1.4, Nude Woman, Venus of Willendorf, there's no facial features, and it's very anonymous. And it's anonymous because they don't want to portray these human-like characteristics in the face upon this goddess element. They would rather keep the symbolism of abundance present in Nude Woman, figure 1.4, versus more of the individual elements of what this one particular woman looked like in figure 1.4a. So that's a comparison and contrast. Then we see the abundance element make its way again into figure 1.5, woman holding a bison horn. And this is meant to be a kind of an expansion on that Venus of Willendorf that we saw in figure 1.4. And they're taking it a little bit further from the voluminous nature of the body that's represented, again, to show that fertility. And there's also a couple more things that's going on. One is she's holding a bison horn, and that bison horn is typically associated with the idea of fertility. If you think of the cornucopia is one of those symbols that represents this copious nature and this abundance that's available to share for all. And we believe that a lot of those symbols of cornucopias and this copious-like nature comes originally from this bison horn. And this bison horn is held as a symbol by, again, this kind of fertility goddess that has been carved out of the stone. All right? Now, while looking at figure 1.5, I need to start talking about some different sculpting techniques. What we've seen thus far with these sculptures, the head of the woman, Venus of Willendorf, the feline body, all the figures leading up to this are sculptures in the round, and they're freestanding. This one, on the other hand, is sculpture in relief. And there's a difference between sculpture in the round, means that you can see it 360 degrees, and then sculpture in relief means that the image has been relieved from the stone or the material that it is originally carved in. So figure 1.5, woman holding a bison horn, is our first example of sculpture in the relief. Then in figure 1.6, two bison reliefs in the cave is our first indicator of not only relief but also modeling. So what they did is they took clay from the riverbeds, they brought it in, and they impacted it upon this stone inside of this cave. And that's called modeling, meaning they're taking clay and they're adding on top of it, smoothing it out, compressing it, and then starting to shape the images of the two bison, as if they are one is walking up this platform and the other one is walking below the platform. All right. It was originally believed that these were stone bisons that were carved out of the stone present in the rock formation inside of this cave, but we've come back and we've realized that these are two totally different materials. This is clay and it's also stone. And the reason we know that is the cracking in the clay. It's not compatible once it dehydrates with that stone. That stone, that's thermal expansion and contraction, is much, much less than that of the clay once it becomes dehydrated. And that's why the bison are cracked. Again, another example of history is kind of always shifting a little bit during this time. So this is our first example, figure 1.6, two bison as a modeling sculpting technique. And again, you can see the bison, very important, all right? So they'll be featured a lot because they are their guides to help get them through this migration of the Ice Age during the Paleolithic period. Then in figure 1.9, we see the first elements of signatures. And where we see the signatures is in the spotted horses and the negative handprints. And what the negative handprints are is they are placing their hand upon the wall, and inside of what's called a blowpipe, they'll fill the pigments that are dehydrated, and then they'll blow the pigment through the, like a straw, through the straw, or what's called the blowpipe, and then it will hit the back of the hand, and then of course the back of the hand will be coated with this slightly moist pigment, and then of course the spaces in between, which are called the negative spaces, will also where the cave wall is, will also get the pigment, and then they move their hand away, and then you can see their signatures. So instead of writing a name, or instead of putting initials or a family name or anything like that, or a certain symbol, they went on and just put their own hands up on the wall, blew the pigment through the blowpipe, and then removed their hand, and then there you have the signature of the artists that are designing these spotted horses. And you can see that they've also used the blowpipe to spot the horse. So to get the different details and techniques on the horse, they've used the blowpipe to create those circular designs. And it's also believed that the spots to the right, above the horse to the right, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different spots up around the mane of that horse, is supposed to be a mathematical tally that shows exactly what number of spotted horses were present in that location at that time. Remember, what they're doing in this Paleolithic period is they are documenting what they see. All right, they're not trying to really focus on too much imagination. It's just about documenting what they see on a day-to-day basis. Right. And one of the latter pieces that we'll look at in the Paleolithic period is from figure 1.10. The woolly rhinoceros, the wounded man, and disemboweled bison. And what we're seeing here is a large use of charcoal that's here to design all of these different characters, if you will, or all these different individuals, the bison, the man, as well as the woolly rhinoceros. And what's believed here is our first example, or first narrative of death during this time, because we believe, or art historians believe, that there was a confrontation at this place, and territory was being set up with the huntings and gatherers, and we believe that that little bird on a stick is an indicator of territory, like this is part of this family's territory. And there was a confrontation with this individual and the woolly rhinoceros, as well as with the bison. And the woolly rhinoceros has essentially killed them, disemboweled the bison, as well as eliminated the life of the human that was present. And it's also believed that there are 6 little dots behind the backside, or the posterior, of the woolly rhinoceros, which is to the far left. And that number again is a tally, and that tally is to let us know how many woolly rhinoceri are present in that area at that time. So this is someone's first kind of eulogy, if you will, to someone's life in regards to how they passed and who they were. So we believe that this individual has been killed, the wounded man, or he's severely wounded to the point of death, because his mouth is open, so they're starting to show this animation and this kind of more humanistic element, as well as if you talk to any mortician, whenever a male passes, all blood goes to the extremities of the body. So the blood flows to the feet, the blood flows to the hands, to the top of the head, as well as to its male's genitalia. So we believe that there's an erection present in the body of the male, which is another indicator that he probably was killed. So again, this is our first documentation and narrative of someone's life and their mortality, and what bestowed upon them. Okay folks, I'll leave this video at that. I don't want to make all these videos way too long, and then I'll get into Neolithic with the next one. I'm going to try to keep all these at around 30 minutes. Okay, so go on and take a look at this, and then we'll get moving on to Neolithic next. Thank you.